Hey everyone, welcome to session 321 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. In this episode, Dr. John Guercio returns to the program for the fourth time. We have a wide-ranging and practical conversation about leadership through a behavioral lens. John and I dig into what it actually means to lead in applied behavior analysis, especially when so much of the existing leadership can be somewhat hard to access or vague, or, frankly, disconnected from observable behavior. We start by talking about the need to operationalize leadership in behavioral terms. And we talk about the model that he put together with Dr. Paulie Gavoni, which they look at leadership through four repertoires, or as they call them, four leadership hats: leading, training, coaching, and managing. We break down what each of these roles looks like behaviorally, how they function across time, and why effective leaders need to move flexibly between them rather than relying on a single style. A major theme of the episode is the role of positive reinforcement in leadership. That shouldn't really come as a surprise to audience members. John shares real-world examples from his OBM coursework and his work at Cornerstone Behavioral Services, highlighting how difficult but necessary it can be to shift away from punitive and avoidance-based management strategies. We get into why punishment often, quote-unquote, works in the short term, why some leaders continue to rely on it, and how reinforcement-based leadership creates better outcomes for both staff and organizations. We also spend some time disentangling the distinction between leadership and management. One of the segments I enjoyed quite a bit was how John reflected on his own strengths and limitations, talking about how he's more of a visionary and kind of big picture guy, and he supports that by bringing in people who are very good with the details and logistics and systems and things like that, so they can work, I guess, in a complementary way. And boy, I just had a lot of light bulbs going off in terms of the various teams I've been involved with over the years. I think you will probably think the same thing. Throughout the episode, we return to the importance of psychological safety, consistent feedback, and emotional regulation. I know scary. I know it's an ABA podcast, but we talk about that a little bit more detail. We talk about all those things in leadership roles. John shares practical strategies for navigating tough conversations, including how to balance empathy with accountability, how to manage staff expectations, and how to avoid letting emotion drive professional communication. Boy, I think we've all been there, including when and when not to send that email. Or the strongly worded letter, as it were. We talk through some concrete tools and exercises for improving leadership practice, such as symbolic problem-solving activities. We talk about how to surface unspoken issues, written acknowledgement systems, and using assessment tools like the performance diagnostic checklist. John closes by sharing future directions for developing empirically grounded management and assessment tools, along with a preview of his upcoming work at the Stone Soup Conference, which we'll get into shortly. This is a practical conversation for anyone supervising staff, leading teams, or trying to build reinforcing values-consistent organizations in human services. So a really fun conversation. John always brings the good stuff when he comes on the podcast, and this one's no exception. Before we get to the interview itself, well, I want to draw your attention to a couple different things. One is, we do talk about what John's going to be talking about at the upcoming Stone Soup Conference. If you're not familiar with the Stone Soup Conference, well, it's one of the best values in the online conference space. I just got word from the organizers that they have cleared all of their costs, which means every single registration going forward is going to directly fund services for individuals with autism and developmental disabilities. So this is a charity event, essentially, or a fundraising event. You can call it whatever you want to call it. It's a great conference going for a great cause, and it's at a great price. So if you want to learn more, go to the show notes for this episode. There's a link there, and use the promo code podcast26 to save even more at checkout. So John's going to be speaking there, Paulie Gavoni, Dr. Tiffany Kodak, whom we heard from in the previous behavioral observation session. I'm going to be doing a talk, and there's going to be a whole host of others. So learn more you just go to the show notes of this episode or go to Behavior Live, and you can look for it there. We're also brought to you by Office Puzzle. A thriving ABA practice depends on systems that actually support your team, not slow them down. If you struggle with software that's buggy, hard to navigate, or offers little support when you need it the most, you're not alone. That's why so many practices are switching to Office Puzzle. Go to officepuzzle.com/BOP to learn more. Are you looking for a job, or you're looking to see what are the, kind of hot trends in employment in the ABA space? Are you wondering what you should ask for a salary? Are you wondering, hey, is my resume okay? Go to HRIC Recruiting, talk to Barbara Voss. She's been putting BCBAs in great jobs across the United States for over 15 years. That's hricolorado.com. Just go to the show notes for this episode, click on the link there, and schedule a confidential appointment with Barbara right now. Also brought to you by Behavior University. Their mission is to provide university quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. They just have a brand new RBT course that's getting rave reviews. Go check it out at behavioruniversity.com and go to behavioruniversity.com/observations, because when you go there, there's a promo code. Surprise, surprise. There's a promo code. It's called podcast. I know, it's super original, right? If you use the promo code podcast, you'll save 10% at checkout on their courses, their webinars, their on-demand CEUs, and things like that. And last but not least, what are you doing at the end of March? I hope you're going to the Verbal Behavior Conference, either in person, where I'll be able to see you in Austin, Texas, or you could attend online, both live and on demand through the magic of Behavior Live. It's taking place March 26th through 27th in Austin again. It's going to include folks like Doctors Mark Sundberg, Patrick McCreevy, Kyle McGill, Alice Schillingsburg, Sarah Frampton, Andresa D'Souza, and Daniel LaFrance. They're going to share how Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior can guide the assessment and treatment of generative learning challenges in children with autism and other developmental disabilities. There's also a full-day pre-conference workshop on Wednesday, March 25th. Again, go to the show notes for this episode for details, or just search on Behavior Live. And one thing, getting back to the episode itself before we get to the interview, John mentions tons of resources, and I did my best. I have like 1.5 pages to 2 pages of notes. I went through all of them. I tried to find as many links as possible. So again, when he's referencing books and articles and things like that, the show notes are your friend. So go to behavioralobservations.com and check it out. Or you can go to behavioralobservations.com and sign up for the email list, where you'll get the show notes delivered directly to your inbox, usually a day or two after the show publishes. So that's a really easy option that, I don't know, well over 5,000 of your colleagues take advantage of. So sign up for the email list. You get the show notes sent right to your email box, and it's a really straightforward process. So I think that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, please enjoy this fun conversation about supervision, leadership, and all the other related repertoires with Dr. John Guercio.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. John Guercio, thanks for coming back. This is, I believe, I went back and checked, this is your 4th time on the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How's it going today?
It's going great. I saw that as we were emailing back and forth and thought, wow, it is. So as always, it's an honor and it's a privilege to be here.
Well, it's fun because I always love having guests coming back on the show, as I think I've probably told you before, because we can kind of get right into it or follow up on things that we've talked about previously. So the format's a little different than like if I'm talking to someone for the first time. So it's always a treat. And your episodes have always gone over very well with the audience too. So it's, again, good to have you back. And your last appearance wasn't that long ago either. So which is also kind of cool.
That's right. Yeah, that was fairly, it was within the last 6 to 8 months, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So so do people stop you on the street now that, you've had this exposure? You get stopped in the airport? Or,
Matt, I've got, I know we're going to talk about stone soup a little bit later, so I'm not going to let the cat out of the bag, but I have had so many of folks that you're connected with and others that, come up to me and say, hey, or they will reach out to me via email and, hey, I listened to your Behavior Observations podcast. And I felt like we were kind of kindred spirits. You've done this work and you know exactly what I'm going through. And so there's a lot of conversations I'm in the midst of right now because people listen to this and we're one of the whatever it is, 2 to 3% of people that are behavior analysts that are doing this type of work and they're reaching out. So yes, I do get and as I go through and look at it, I can also tell when I've been on here when the Amazon activity for the month comes in because people are going and getting staff training manuals and books and those types of things, which is really dissemination is kind of the key. So this has been huge for that. So much appreciated for all of that.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's good stuff. Glad to help get it out there. And I think you and Dr. Adrian Fitzer were about to put out the RBT course for adults. I don't
Yes.
know if that was live yet at the time or not, but I should have gone back to check before recording this, but I assume that's up and running and
It's up and
people are
running. It
people are
actually went live about a year ago. We now have the 2026 curriculum because that changed with the board
okay.
in terms of what the requirements are, additional trainings and things like that. So that is live, and there are a number of individuals that are kind of going through that. And I even have suggested for organizations that if you have individuals that have gone through and done existing RBT trainings, but they're working in the adult world, to have them go, at least to go look at this. And because there are a lot of individuals that, will add a little bit of reliability to what we already know is that the examples that we give and the way that we couch the technical terms within the realm of adult services, it really helps people to get that a lot better because there's just so many people that, all the new RBTs that we hire here at the Arc of the Ozarks at Cornerstone Behavioral Services, we also have them go through that curriculum because a lot of people come in and they're not prepared when they take the other one. So yes, that's been rolling for gosh, I guess it's close to a year now. It's hard to believe.
Awesome. Well, it's cool that you're putting that stuff out there for folks who are in doing that really, really important work. It's going to be even more important as the individuals with autism and developmental disabilities continue to age, and the today's
Mhm.
kids become adults. So I'll be sure to put links in the show notes of where people can find that, as well as your books and links to your previous episodes as well. So if people want, there's always people encountering the podcast for the first time, and so if people want to do a deeper dive on all things John, they can just go to behavioralobservations.com and the links will be waiting for them there. So anyway,
Yeah, much
um,
appreciated because that's and folks don't have to just dive right into the 40-hour training if they're already at RBT. We have what we call a bridge training. It's 15 hours. And so if you're already at RBT and don't want to rehash and go over that, it's 15 hours of what you absolutely have to know if you're working in adult services. So
okay.
it's more of a boiled down version. So there's it's still on the website for ABAC, the Applied Behavior Analysis Center, but it's just under the RBT Bridge course, and then the other one is the full RBT course.
Okay. Well, when we conclude the podcast interview itself, then I'll make sure we get the links to all of that stuff so people can go check it out.
You
Um,
bet.
Today, however, we're talking about something a little broader, talking about leadership.
Yes, sir.
And I know you and both of our very good friend, Dr. Paulie Gavoni, have an article that is out for review right now, and you can maybe update me on what the review status of that article is. But the draft of the manuscript I'm looking at right now is Behaviorally Based Leadership, a Functional Conceptualization of Positive Reinforcement in Organizational Culture. And again, that's you and Polly. And so, it's one of those topics that there's can't be too much conversation about. Any behavior analyst is going to be in charge of leading and directing the behavior of others. And as you point out in the article, there are both productive and non-productive ways of going about that.
Yeah. Right.
And so I thought this would be a fun conversation to have, kind of not just go through the article itself, but really try to, talk about some of the themes that folks will encounter. So behavior analysts who are perhaps newer in these leadership roles can, learn some concepts and principles and maybe even some tactics about how to be more effective. So having said all that, let's get into it. I always whenever someone is talking about a particular article, I always like to start with this question. We'll get into the content of the article itself, but I'm always curious about like what motivated you and Paulie to write this in the first place. What was there's lots of stuff on leadership, even in behavior analytics circles, that's out there, and so I'm curious, what hole were you trying to fill? What was not there that you were trying to address with the paper that you shared with me?
Well, it's interesting, Matt, because as you talk about it, there's a lot of books that are out there, but there are virtually no articles. I teach an OBM course at St. Louis University, and through the process of going through that, and there Washington University in St. Louis is also opening up a new BCBA program that should be coming down the line, here pretty soon. A master's program. I don't think I'm letting the cat out of the bag too early because we want to kind of let folks know about it. But in that course, I go through and there's one article. There's one. It's Podsikov et al. In 1984, and I'll give you the link for that so we can put it in the show notes. But it's not even from one of our journals. It's from Organizational Behavior and Human Performance as the journal. And there are questions that are in there, and it actually defines for the reader positive reinforcement-based leader behaviors, negative reinforcement-based leader behaviors, positive punishment, negative punishment, leadership behaviors. And there are a set of 10 questions that go along with each area that I use for myself. Do you praise your staff regardless of their performance? Right? Okay, and that's a no-no. This is not just about praise, praise, praise. And I think sometimes, it's, we can thank R.B. Daniels and all the wonderful work that he's done about looking at positive reinforcement and working with staff. But this particular article we read, and then I give students a challenge at the end of every semester. If you can find one article that is along this same line, you get 5 to 10 points, depending on how behavioral it is, on your final exam, and nobody can find one. And so people look, and there's some that are indirectly related. I've looked at JOBM, I've looked at, but a lot of them, as I look at my shelf, we had one of our managers here that was struggling, and I've got the Measure of a Leader on my bookshelf over there by R.B. Daniels, and I bought him a copy of that because that's where a lot of the seeds of this came in. But then there's also a book that Dr. Gavoni and I are really fond of. It's Judith Komaki, and it's an operant approach to leadership behavior. And so, her book is out there, and I think I've got the reference to 1998. So it's been a little while, since it's been out there. But that really, outside of R.B. Daniels, is all that's there. And when you look at the literature itself, what we have in our journals today, the stuff just isn't there. And so as you're going through it, Paulie and I would talk at conferences and say, man, we've got to do this. We have to do this article. And then we kind of blended kind of what we had worked on because, he actually has some thoughts about leadership and talks a lot about that. And, I've even got one of the quotes from one of his books that, the signs of leadership. And so I've actually used that as a checklist. And oddly enough, I have done that presentation in front of leaders and they laugh at it because they don't recognize it themselves. They don't recognize it that they're doing it themselves. So that was kind of our challenge. Let's look at this. Let's try to put something together that is behavioral in nature, but that also translates behavioral technology into the leadership field as opposed to it just being another Franklin Covey book, or something like that. Because a lot of businesses, I worked for a gentleman years ago, and he was an MBA, and a pretty sharp guy, but he was all into this objective-based management, which no data on, and it was basically was a Franklin Covey thing. And the Franklin Covey is basically, I think Stephen Covey is a businessman, but I think a lot of the origins of that I want to say came from Benjamin Franklin. So a lot of the Franklin Covey stuff kind of combines a lot of that information. And so anytime I can get a book, The 7 Habits of Effective Leaders, or, I'm going to throw out a bunch of titles today that are really non-behavior analytic, but they're behavioral if you read them. And I use the interviews with my staff when I do this. So that's one of the things that I want to get out there is that I think for Paulie and I both is that we both live this every day and have had, and I'll give you some examples, but have had the experiences, unfortunately, of living under a punitive leader to where you never want to do it again. And, you want to be able to kind of get to that point. I'm reading a great book now it's called the last of the buffalo leaders, and essentially it is a situation where it's the owner of the Johnsonville sausage manufacturing company. They're still pretty big, but I think he wrote this in the early 2000s. But he talks about he was a buffalo herder, that he was the boss and he told everybody else what to do, but that the secret to doing what is going to lead to a successful business is delegation, and before that, positive reinforcement. And so a lot of these things I will read because, I want my staff here and our staff that work with us at Cornerstone to know that what we're doing is based on an operative analysis of leadership and things that work. And so I think that, with this being a theoretical model, our hope is that we can kind of dig a little deeper. I would love to be able to crank this paper out into some type of an assessment that we could look at, and that maybe look at that and then maybe have some type of an analysis as to how that company functions, whether it's an ABA company and my hope is, and I think from the way I read it, companies like Google, Berkshire Hathaway, all the others that are out there, they're very successful. They use a lot of this, but they just don't use behavioral terminology to describe it.
A lot of ABA practices share a similar story. They start with practice management software that promises to do it all, but the reality is slow load times, confusing features, and support teams that never seem to be available. Eventually, the system becomes something everyone dreads using. If that sounds familiar, Office Puzzle was built specifically for you. Office Puzzle is an all-in-one ABA practice management platform designed to simplify the work across your entire team, from owners and clinical directors to BCBAs and RBTs. You'll get fast, reliable data collection, intuitive scheduling, streamlined notes and documentation, and billing tools that help you stay compliant and efficient. Office Puzzle offers transparent pricing at $19.99 per user per month without locking you into a long-term contract. And you can try everything completely free for 30 days. If you want software that supports your practice instead of slowing it down, visit officepuzzle.com/BOP to start your free trial. Yeah, and I think there's probably a danger of, not anchoring these things to scientific principles because it makes it hard to replicate. It's just like gets chalked up to the Google or whatever fill in the blank companies, their quote unquote culture, which
Right, exactly.
which doesn't give you or I or anyone else a roadmap of how to follow it. So anyway, you mentioned so many things. I already have a half sheet of notebook paper filled with follow-up questions. There's a lot of things I want to circle back to.
Sure.
But before getting to that though, I want to, and you guys touched on this in the paper, and I thought it was a really good point, but let's dig a little deeper into it. Why do you think leadership is such a challenging concept to really wrap your arms around? And I think one of the things that people think of when they think of a leader is someone who's charismatic. They have this magnetism. They have this, personality. And you say it's a very, terms that are very, very foreign to us as behavior analysts, and, things that we might, kind of dismiss, I guess, or at least, just kind of pass on trying to operationalize in one way or another. I guess my question is, John, why do you think leadership in particular seems to be this magnet for these, kind of very different, challenge, these very wishy-washy kind of attributes,
Right. No, I don't mean any negativity by this, but a lot of people that will kind of tell you that, one of the initial leaders of Apple, himself was a little bit of a,
Yeah.
as you look at that, Steve Jobs, and everything that you read about, that's how. And so here's my idea about it. And I just say this because of experience. When a lot of the classes that I teach in OBM, I have a lot of students that bleed over, and they are MBA students and they've never heard any of this stuff. Because in the MBA program, you're taught to manage to a bottom line. You're financially responsible for a certain set of numbers. And so the first two classes of the semester in my OBM class, we actually compare and contrast IO psychology, and that as we're going through and looking at that we look at the individual and kind of how things are set up, right? And so as individuals go through and they set up industrial organizational psychology is, how do I look at a questionnaire that's going to be able to tell me somebody's motivation or somebody's self-esteem? And a lot of those things, the Myers-Briggs assessment, which gives you you have a TLMO or whatever, your letters are, but it tells you you're a visionary or you're a leader or you work through certain things. And so as you go through, I found over the years that doesn't help people to understand how they need to be supervised or how an individual should supervise. So in our OBM course, we kind of go through and we look at a person's Myers-Briggs score. And then I ask questions. Okay, how do you like to be supervised? How often do you like your feedback? Do you like it via the phone? Do you like it via text, via email? And I'm trying to see if there are clusters of behavior that are showing up for, TSLM or whatever your acronym is when you do the Myers-Briggs or the Briggs-Myers, whenever you go through that, to make it a little bit more behavioral. But, I do think that, some of the things, again, with all due respect to Steve Jobs, that some people will tell you he was very difficult to work with, but a visionary, okay, and changed everything that we do today. But he had a vision. And the way that was approached, who knows how that would have been approached, if there were people that didn't live in a fear-based society. So I think it's that. I think people are living to a bottom line. And I think that as a result of that, a lot of people feel like that as you get to a certain point in your leadership, that you have to be tough and you have to be rough. In the days of Vince Lombardi, in football, the coach of the Green Bay Packers, nowadays in the NFL, you have to be a player's coach. A lot of these guys are making $30 million a year, and you can't curse at them and tell them what to do and bench them without there being some type of a fallback or some type of pushback that the person engages in. So I think that's the number one issue, is that in the pursuit of being able to hold to a bottom line, the amount of money you make or your expenditures or whatever, I think a lot of times that pushes people out of their comfort zone. And so as a result of that, they tend to be more punitive than they are reinforcing.
Hey, I just want to take another quick break here. In case you missed it at the top of the show, I want to remind you about the 2026 Verbal Behavior Conference. It's coming up March 26th and 27th in Austin, Texas, where you can join us virtually via live stream and on demand through the magic of Behavior Live. And there is a full-day workshop the day before the conference on March 25th. Now, you can go to the show notes for this episode and see the laundry list of verbal behavior luminaries who will be there. And yeah, it's awesome. One of the things I like to share with folks, if you actually go to the conference itself, you have lots and lots of opportunities to interact with these presenters directly. There's a lot of breaks. There's like a happy hour. We all have lunch in the same place. So if you're on the fence about whether to make the trip to Austin, I think it's worth it. If you really want to, I guess, imbue yourself in this work and have some deep conversations with folks about Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior, it's kind of the place to be. There's really nothing quite like it. And so I highly recommend trying to get there in person. The second best thing, obviously, is to attend online. And what's funny is that I think this is like my 6th or 7th verbal behavior conference, and I recognize the names of the people who come up in the chat, who come year after year after year and get a lot of meaningful interaction out of the online experience. So even if you can't make the short drive to Austin, you can participate through Behavior Live. And yeah, you're not going to be able to go to the happy hour. And yeah, you're not going to be able to pick Pat McGreevy's brain at lunch or talk to, Kyle Miguel or whatever while he's getting coffee, etc. But it's pretty darn close, and Behavior Live does an amazing job bringing this experience directly to your laptop or tablet or whatever. So, yeah, so all that to say, we'll get back to the conversation with John here in a second, but boy, it is really like a conference like no other. So if you haven't checked it out, please take it into consideration. You can go to the show notes for this episode or just look it up on Behavior Live. And if you do go to Austin, be sure to say hi. I hope to see you there. All right, let's get back to this conversation with John. It's funny. I was putting these questions together while watching the Sunday football games yesterday, and I was actually, reading the article and thinking about leadership. And of course, I'm a New England Patriots fan. Sorry to just about everyone else in the, who's listening to this, but
Oh,
anyway,
Drake May's great.
yeah, Drake May, boy, yeah, Drake May's great. I can't disagree with that. MVP. Let's hope. Anyway. But, obviously when you think of the New England Patriots in their heyday, you think of Bill Belichick and this dour, taskmaster and things like that. And then when I've seen interviews when in talking to former players, they're like, yeah, he was like that. And he was, very hard on people and things like that. But there was also a different side of Belichick that people never, ever saw publicly. And that he weirdly enough, he could be very warm and engaging, but he could also be had that other side.
How's that working for him today?
Oh yeah, that's a whole different podcast
with college students, and I think also, not to delve too deeply into NFL, but look up some YouTube videos on Bill Parcells in his approach. He won Super Bowls, and also it was with that approach. But I do think that as time moves on and society changes, we get into these things where punitive leadership just it doesn't move the needle as much as it used to. I'll just put it that.
Yeah. And not to get too far down an NFL rabbit hole and for everyone else who, is blissfully ignorant of this, I'll apologize in advance and try to move on very quickly from this into something more substantive. But please indulge me for the next, 30 seconds here. It seems like Mike Vrabel, the current coach of the Pats, is able to kind of walk that fine line where he's got a very, very good relationship and good rapport with his players, and can also, keep on them and, call them out when necessary. But I think it's based out of that foundation of some positivity there too. And let's take this out more broadly. So, because as you were talking there, John, it reminded me of one of my favorite bosses. I worked for Dr. Leanne Millender. To this day, one of the top 3 smartest people I've ever known. Just a brilliant, brilliant woman. I remember a lot of my behavior was organized around not disappointing her.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, I was like, because that was like, it she didn't mean to be this way, but it's like I looked up to her so highly, and it's like, just like mild disappointment was like so aversive.
You didn't want her disapproval.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was just like, and again, it's nothing she set up or anything like that. And it was probably has to do with, my personality characteristics and how I show up too, and whatnot. But, it was just reflecting on that. It was just kind of like, well, that's a really funny source of motivation. And again, to her credit, nothing engineered specifically by her is, but I just, she always had something really insightful to say, and always had something to point out in my work that I didn't think of and whatnot. And I'd be like, oh, be like the Chris Farley show, like, oh, I'm so stupid.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to avoid that feeling as much as possible, And so it was just kind of a fascinating dynamic. But all right, another quick break here. You heard me talk about Behavior University at the top of this show. They've got this newly revised RBT course. It's getting rave reviews. They've got a supervision course that's really solid too. And they have these free webinars that you can sign up for. I'm looking at their webinar page. They have 8 webinars scheduled. And guess what? 5 of them are sold out. That's how popular these are. They really do an amazing job curating great speakers and great topics, but you got to get on these right away. The best way to find out when these webinars are happening and when you can sign up so you don't miss out is to get on their email list. So go to behavioruniversity.com, hop on their email list, and don't miss the next webinar. And if you want to take any of their courses, if you want on-demand CEUs, use the promo code podcast at checkout to save. That's behavioruniversity.com, or just hit the show notes from this episode to learn more. All right, let's get back to John. Thanks for indulging me. Let's try to get back on track here. So,
sure.
So in the paper, you guys frame leadership into 4 categories: leading, training, coaching, and managing. So can you hit those real quick, and then certainly we can go into more detail as the conversation unfolds here. But just in general, what is meant by
Yes.
those four
Yes.
repertoires or four hats, as you call them?
Well, all the credit and all the intellectual property for that goes to Dr. Gavoni. Those are his. And so we basically, the interest as we started talking about this paper was how can we blend these concepts into what we've just talked about, being a reinforcing leader. So I know that as we look at it, you've got the four, he calls them hats. And so we'll wait to see what the reviewers say, if the language is too casual or if it's, management styles. But leading, training, coaching, and managing, okay, are the four. And so some of our listeners now could say, well, gosh, some of those sound like they are very, very similar. And so as you go through the process, let's say that you're having a new staff person, and the idea is how do you onboard somebody and then continue? Let's say they're with you for 25 years in your organization. How do you walk them through these four hats and as a leader? So as you go through with the leading part, that's what you mentioned earlier. That's whether it's the charisma or the way that you communicate your mission and vision and values, because that's the part folks know here that we've talked about pearls before and our interactional strategies that we use and to rate positive interactions and the work that Mark Dixon and I have done with that. But staff know you're not going to have an inappropriate interaction with the client. You're not going to threaten. You're not going to use inappropriate language. That's just the mission. And so essentially, as we've gone through, I think, Paulie brilliantly kind of has couched that in his books as looking at that as an establishing operation. How do you and some of the management books would say something that would be more, it's not really that tangible, where they might say creating a hunger in your staff. Well, what does that mean? No, it's an establishing operation. And so I know for a lot of the individuals that are here, our behavior analysts that are listening, I'd go to battle with them any day of the week, but they buy into our mission statement. And so that's why that part is so that's the leading component. And then that kind of flows into, training. We know that's, shaping new skills. If we have behavior analysts that come from early intervention experience and now they're working with adults, we have to shape that. The coaching part, that's more, I think, again, Paulie brilliantly putting that into, that's the generalization part. Okay, I'm now going to coach you through, you're having this interaction, but now you're having this interaction with a coworker or a Department of Mental Health worker. How do you generalize those skills that we got to in training to where we can now do this in the next step? So he couches that under coaching. And then managing is the long term. It's just how do you manage these skills over time? And so I think that these are some, I think, commonly misused terms in organizational industrial psychology. And people talk all the time about leading and, and training. And that one's pretty easy. But the idea in this paper was to take those four concepts, those four hats, and actually give them a firm ABA foundation and explain what they all are, because they're all part of the process. And I think as you look at leading, training, coaching, managing, you more than likely, you could even number them 1 through 4 in terms of where they would be in the progression of your staff over time. But that's the idea. But yeah, those are terms Paulie has used for those that are familiar with his books. And I think this is a great integration in being able to, in this particular paper, we define what each of those are. We kind of also look at what are some key leadership behaviors. Create a drive in the person. No, there's other things that we define, behaviorally, but how do you provide choices? How do you actually guide and do behavioral skills training with your staff as opposed to these things that are maybe more general terms that are layman's terms? And then there's different examples and indicators. So our hope was that once someone goes through those 4 areas, that they get to the point and say, hey, okay, I see how I can apply that as a leader, whether I'm the lead RBT, the lead BCBA, the manager of a program, or the VP, and how you could actually put these things in place. So that's the whole idea, and that's kind of the foundation, and that's Paulie's. Those are Paulie's babies, and I think we did a really, of course, I'm partial, but I think we did a really good job of integrating that and understanding not only what that means, but how to explain it to others in behavioral terms and to use our science to coach as opposed to, going and doing consultation that maybe, the individual may not understand that. But if you couch it in scientific OBM-based terms, it makes a lot more sense.
Are you looking for a new job, but you're overwhelmed with all the emails that you're getting from various ABA agencies? What if there was someone who was in your corner and could help you find the perfect job placement? Well, that person exists. Barbara Voss has been working as a recruiter for over 30 years, and her company, HRIC, specializes in placing BCBAs in permanent full-time positions throughout the United States. Barbara has been placing BCBAs since 2011, so she knows our business, and she offers personalized service to any BCBA looking for a new position. She also helps companies looking to hire BCBAs too. Here are just some of the things Barbara can help you with. She can provide information about salary ranges in different markets across the country. She can help you write your resume. She can coordinate and prepare you for the interview process, and even help negotiate the right salary for you. And best of all, there are no charges to any candidate for all of these services. When you're ready to make a change and want to work with someone who will listen to you and understand what you need in a new position, contact Barbara at HRIC. To schedule a confidential discussion, head over to hricolorado.com. Again, that's hricolorado.com, and hit the contact button to connect with Barbara. You won't be disappointed. Can you be a good leader and not a good manager, or vice versa? Can you, or I guess another way of asking the question is, can those two terms, at least to my mind, just from a kind of I don't know, colloquial understanding, have some overlap to them?
Mm-hmm.
How important is the distinction between those terms, and can you maybe share some examples of one and the other and things like that?
It's a great point, because I sometimes and I've seen it. I don't think a good manager can be a good leader at times, because sometimes a good manager is all concerned about the logistics and how this goes. And I'll tell you right now, anybody listening to this that knows me, they'll tell you, I'm not a details guy. Okay. I am, and our organization here, we opened up the St. Louis office of the Arc of the Ozarks. And there is an Arc of St. Louis. So just to distinguish ourselves, we actually are known as Cornerstone Behavioral Services in the St. Louis area now. So as a result of that, some of the things that, as people kind of come into and look at our business and kind of what we're doing, the Arc has been around in Missouri for over 60 years. So we just opened this market in January. So everything that's in this paper, we've had to do over the last year. We've had to create directors. We've had to put program supervisors in place, hire new staff. So we're about a year into it. We're close to 100 staff now, but everything that's in the paper we've had to do. But what I have found is that I'm not a details guy. So what do I have to do? I have to surround myself with detailed people. So I've got a lot of people that are very skilled in every little I being dotted and every T being crossed, and they go through, and I tell them, do not hesitate if you see that I've missed a detail to point it out to me as we go through that. And then the reciprocity of that is, if they're struggling with what's the vision of this whole thing and what we're doing, then that's where the leading comes in. I think, to say, okay, let me paint the picture. And actually, I just got an email I'm seeing now from JOBM, and I think there's some permission, so it looks like it was accepted. So let's
We're breaking news
yeah, we
live
get
here on the
breaking
behavioral
news.
observation.
Yes,
Scoop exclusive.
Yes, we get this. So Paulie, I'll call you later. So as we're going through this, though, I think that many of those skill sets don't work. So if you're really skilled at being a manager, and I worked for a lady, and I may have told you this story before in one of our previous episodes, but she was a previous organization I worked for. She was the director, and she had an assistant director, and we had gone through a review by the state, and things didn't go too well. There were some medication issues and some nursing problems. And so the director put it all on this assistant director, and the assistant director didn't have time to make all these corrections. And she communicated that. And, what happened is the director said, I don't care, get it done. And as a result, the assistant director started crying. He said, why are you doing this to me? And she said, why are you treating me like this? And she said, because I've earned it. And at that point, I looked at that and I thought, wow, people think that when you get seniority and you move up in leadership, some people, that you earn the right to treat people like that. And so what I don't, and I'm not trying to be silly, but this is my director here gave me this
Okay.
for Christmas.
All right. So for
And,
folks, hold on,
you know,
hang on. This is since most people are going to listen to this, that
yes.
it's a plaque that says "Best Boss and Mentor Ever," Dr. John M. Guercio.
Okay. So people could say, well, certainly your director is going to give you that. But I think that, as we talk to people, and I ask people, okay, well, why do you feel comfortable working here? The measure of that is longevity, but also the fact that you feel like you can come in and vent if you need to, or to be able to problem solve about certain things. So I think that's the big issue. But all these skills, I can't think of anybody. Steve Jobs, anybody that we've talked about, Bill Gates, that have all of these. So you have to surround yourself with individuals that are more skilled. So to answer your question, I think that you could be a good manager, maybe not a good leader, or you could be a good leader and maybe not be a good manager of people.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that distinction helps a lot. And yeah, I am not a details guy either. So it's one of the reasons I admire the work of all the behavior analysts out there doing that really careful and difficult EIBI programming where, trying to get language out of kids and things like that. And, we've learned X many mans and tax and we need to move on to this, that. And it's like, that sort of thing, I could never, ever, I've done it, but I knew very early on in my career that was not something that I have the attention to detail to really do that at a high level, like so many of our colleagues do. So
Well, I
I
know I've loved and enjoyed listening to your talks with John Barrero and the Java series and going through and Jeff Tiger and listening to the level of detail that those guys talk about research and rigor and the way it goes into. Sometimes I'm driving and my jaw's dropping. It's like, wow, okay, this is fantastic. Louis Agopian, he's a good colleague and friend and, talking to him a lot. I think
you're going to be hearing more from him soon. So
okay, great, great. But just looking at those types of things and trying to figure out, how that is set up. And so we recently did a paper here on the use of the good behavior game with adults, and we just
ooh,
had Pat Fryman and wonderful data. And we had Pat Fryman and Tony Biglin were here for our Moaba conference. And so I got them both together and I said, okay, because Tony Biglin is the PAC's good behavior game. And, a lot of the work he's done with Steve Hayes. And then, and Pat Fryman said, send it to Java. I said, oh, whoa. I said, really? No, send it to Java. He said, if anything, he said the reviews that you get and the detail that are involved in that would help you, if it's not accepted in Java to go to another journal. And so, we've had some things that, that have gone there, but I think that, again, I just wanted to kind of give the shout out to those guys because it is. I mean, that's a fantastic way of looking at things, but to have that detailed mindset, I think sometimes it's okay to be able to say, you know what, that's not me. Let me leverage my skill set in the way that I might, and then have others around you that can maybe support those areas that, I may not have that's not my strong suit.
yeah, I totally agree. And I don't know, maybe that's why I'm a talk show host these days instead of anything more substantive. So, all right.
No,
So,
it helps. It is
self-deprecation
tremendous help.
notwithstanding. All right. Your your paper goes into some detail about, talking about, warning against the overuse of negative management practices, negative reinforcement in particular, and how it could be counterproductive. I was reading it and I'm like, well, this really isn't front page news, right?
Mhm.
This should be common knowledge to anyone with any type of behavior analytic training. And so on the one hand, I'm like, why is this here? This is pretty straightforward and we should all understand this. On the other side of the coin, you go on these ABA Facebook pages or Reddit and things like that, and they're replete with all these stories of employees, frankly, being treated badly.
Mm.
And there may be a selection bias as it relates, or relating to who talks about these things online or not. And so I'm not going to paint the entire. I'm not going to say, oh, the field is going to hell in a handbasket or anything, or whatever. But there's a signal there. We can debate the strength of the signal, but some number of people, a non-zero number of people, are having and reporting on these experiences. So all of that to say, John, why do you think you know, given that this should be a very straightforward thing for those with a behavior analytic background and preparation, why is it so hard to avoid these traps of being overly negative in your management and leadership practices?
I think, Matt, it's kind of the answer maybe lies in delay discounting framework. I think you get the sooner, smaller reinforcer by, maybe chewing somebody out and, having them go through, I need this done right now, as opposed to the longer term reinforcers that you get by investing in the person and working with them. But I think we all know certain things. I mean, we know that you need to eat a certain amount of fruits and vegetables and you need to do certain things. But, go to the line at any McDonald's today and look how many people are in line. Okay. Look a few days ago at how many New Year's resolutions that there were and how many we know what to do. We just don't do it. And I think that's the reason that we had to write this paper, because we all know and we've all had those experiences. One of the in over the past year, I don't know how many people we've had in here for interviews, but one of the questions that's on there, my favorite question actually, is who is your favorite boss you've ever worked for and why? And you get a lot of information about that. And it may surprise you, but not one said because they would really let me have it if I didn't do the right thing. Man, they could chew me out. And they made me feel, like I was worthless. Not one of them said that. They either were empowering, they either delegated quite a bit. They were good coaches. They were able to coach the person through an issue. They were supportive. We all talk about the open door policy. This is one of the few times my door is closed. Usually the door is open, so if people need to come in and talk. But we all know when people all say open door policy, but most of those folks, you walk by the door and it's closed. So I think we all know what to do. I think that we have a hard time putting those behaviors into effect because it's too easy on the short term to go through and just say, do it, get it done. And, there are times where I have an email and I want to send to somebody, and I always follow the rule. If I'm heated in any way, or there's any type of, a setting event or something going on with me, I'll wait till the next day to send the email, because at that point, you are getting more to the facts and you're getting less to what all the negativity might be involved with that. So I think that's a big factor. I think it's easier. I think folks rely on that a lot more because it's easier, and it's same reason we use punishment. Same reason we've used punishment in our field for years, and we're getting away from that now, is because it produced quick suppression of behavior and, didn't generalize too well. You always had to continue to use the punisher, but that's another reason this is still used all the time. Because the reason punishment works is because it's a quick suppression of behavior, but you have to use it on a regular basis to continue to get those outcomes. So I think that's the thing. People get into a rut. I get into a managerial rut, and as a result of that, people bring their moods to work, or I've had clients tell staff, listen, you're in a really bad mood today. I need you to go out back outside and come back in again. But people have a hard time separating a little bit, I think, what's going on, in that aspect of their lives, and then coming into work and then, treating people in a way that reflects that. So I just think it's one of those things about always being present. I want to tack on something that we mentioned and we talked a little bit about earlier. We talked about, how we measure things or how people could be punitive at work. And I think that one of the things when we talked about Steve Jobs is John Austin's fabulous book Results has got a lot in there about, and I think I misspoke about it on our last podcast. So I'm going to do like an erratum or to go through and correct it. I termed it psychological flexibility, and it's psychological safety.
Yes.
And so psychological flexibility is one thing altogether. It's an ACT concept about, being able to kind of be more present with certain things and stimuli that are happening. But psychological safety is being able to go through, and I've told all of our staff here that if I forgot to do something, text me. You're safe to do that. Or if we're in a meeting and, we've done this and I'm telling one of our behavior analysts to get the behavior plan written right now, I want somebody to step up and say, but John, they haven't done an FBA yet. Oh, okay. The safety to speak out loud. And most of the stuff you read about those leaders, whether Steve Jobs from, people that write, there wasn't that safety to speak up. Because if you did, You either might be shouted down or and this is the owner of the company. How do you do that? But I think that even somebody with that much power can still have an environment of psychological safety where people feel like they can speak up, because I really do. I think people put in the time and they think that if they're able to do these things and they have gotten to this point of leadership, that they are immune from troubles. And so they treat people that way. So I just think it's a way, if you start leading like this early in your career and you can continue to do that, I think that's Paulie and I's hope, is that as people read this, you can start out being that lead RBT and maybe finish your coursework and go all the way up and use this. And I tell our staff all the time, the way that we're doing this right now, because the individuals that we work with now, many of them have been in environments that were extremely punitive, and they realize that it's different here. And, the leadership is that everything we have in the paper is that's how we lead and that's how we coach people. But I think anybody that's been through a punitive environment like that will tell you that it is traumatic and you have to be able to get through that. But I think that's why we have so much of it. It works, but you have to overuse it to get it to continue to work. And I think that for years, whether it's been in, our interventions, both with clinical populations or in our leadership behavior, those things have continued to happen. I do want to give a one shout out to maybe a bit of a book that I don't think many of our listeners would have read. And if you have, kudos. But it's Douglas McGregor. He wrote a book in the 70s, I want to say, and I know I've got it here somewhere. Oh my gosh, 1960. Long, long time ago. But it's called The Human Side of Enterprise. And that book is one of my favorite management books. I can remember in grad school, I was a student teacher for one of Mark Dixon's OBM courses, and he was talking about type X and type Y leaders. And, there are, and Douglas McGregor was the first one to talk about that. The type X leader thinks that all employees are lazy. They have to be motivated to come to work. They all want to avoid work, and they can't be supported to be independent. The type Y leader feels like that people can be motivated, that people can take on the mission of the organization and do well, just as much as the VP, as the person that's a direct support staff, and they feel like that staff are to be invested in. And so he distinguished that years ago. And so we've got a table in the paper that has the defining properties of a type X and a type Y. So all of our staff now, if they've had a poor interaction with someone, I ask them, is it type X or type Y? And they can tell me. And so I think that as we've done this with Paulie's rubric, of the hats, leading, training, coaching, and managing, with that rubric, we can actually go through and then say, okay, well, as if we're doing all these hats, we're type Y folks, and we're getting away from the type X. But most managers that people have today are type X managers. I'm not meaning the type X that we usually use that are, hyper motivated or high blood pressure, or, maybe are prone to, heart attacks and those types of things. But maybe there is a relationship, but it's all about the behavior. And McGregor was writing about this in the 60s, and I don't think that we've picked up enough of that to move it forward. So that's our hope, that we're doing this.
Hey everyone, real quick break, and it's the last one of the episode too. So we're on the home stretch. Thanks for bearing with me. If you need CEUs and you want to get them while you are multitasking, whether you're on your commute, you're at the gym, you're walking your dog, or whatever else you do while you listen to podcasts, you can go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs and see the well over 60 plus, we might be over 70, I don't know, I have to check, CEU events that we have available from your favorite podcast guests. So you can just, again, go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs to learn more. And there are bulk discounts. So if you want to grab a bunch, if you have some catching up to do, no judgment, I've certainly been there, you can grab a bunch and save a bundle while you're at it. So again, go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs to learn more. All right, let's get right back into the conclusion of this fun conversation with John. Thanks. Follow up to that point, and you've already talked about a couple of things that people can reflect on, but if there's a listener out there listening to this conversation and they're like, oh my gosh, how am I doing? And they want to manage or lead more effectively. What might be some questions they ask themselves? Given what you've talked about thus far in terms of how do I know? I mean, obviously, there's there's probably some things that are pretty basic,
Mhm.
but I'm just, what might be some questions someone could ask themselves? I want to speak mainly to like maybe early stage BCBAs who are maybe new to this sort of thing, but it could be anybody, I suppose.
Well, the I don't know if I've mentioned this one or not yet. There's a great book I've got on my desk here, How to Say Anything to Anyone by Sherry Harley. I picked this up because I've over the course of years of supervising students, there are different things that I will pick up and I'll find a table or something that's in there. And in her book, she's got 3 questions that she recommends that if you're, like I said, RBT supervisor, lead RBT, whatever, 3 main questions. What do I need to do more of? What do I need to do less of? And what do I need to keep doing the same? And that gives you a pretty good idea as opposed to maybe somebody going up to Steve Jobs and saying, "Man, you're mean. You don't listen to us. You don't do so." You phrase it, well, what do I need to do more of? Well, I would love if you were to sit down and listen to my point of view without you correcting me and giving me your solution. What do I need to do less of? Those reply all emails where you kinda call me out, that probably would be great if you did less of that, and what do I need to be doing the same? Well, I really, like our happy hours, our team here, we go out and again, it's not we don't close the bar down. I leave in time. If others, they wanna close it down, that's fine, but just to go out, hang out, have dinner, and be able to get together with your team and do it sometime outside of the office. We just did this at the Italian part of St. Louis is on the hill, and this restaurant we go to is called Favazza's, and we have our Christmas dinner there every year. But we have employees, we have their significant others, and they all show up, and that's their favorite time of the year. If you mine too, if you ask folks. So I think that would be something where, okay, what do you want us to keep doing? So I think those 3 questions will help you whether you're the executive VP or if you're a student rep or a lead RBT. Any of those things I think will give you more guidance into, oh wow, I am excessive with that, or man, I really don't praise people that much. I've got a staff now, and she's gonna know that I'm calling her out, but she's one of our directors in Springfield, and she is always sending emails to me and to HR giving commendations to her staff. Please include this as a commendation for this staff person. And she'll describe in 3, 4 sentences what they're doing. And it's like, wow. And then it dawns on me, I need to be doing more of that, which I'm going to be doing one today, as a matter of fact. But I think those are things that they're quick, dirty. They're not, extended. They're really quick questions that anybody could answer. And I think leadership at any level, you will gain a lot by being able to get answers to those 3.
All right. So let's shoot the question in the other direction. One of the things I curious about, see, if you've seen this, is there a risk of overgeneralizing the I'm just going to be positive, I want to be liked by the staff, et cetera, to the point of maybe not correcting employee performance that needs to change for the betterment of the clients? I guess more succinctly stated, is there a risk of the pendulum swinging too far in the other direction where it's all sunshine and rainbows?
It absolutely is. And I there are times where I tell my staff, we have meetings and I say, listen, I had a mom for a young man I served probably 15 years ago, maybe even 20. And she said, we were talking one day and she said, John, she said, you need to make sure that none of your staff take your meekness for weakness. And it hit me and I'm like, whoa, okay. That really is. So I will tell staff sometimes, hey, let's not get too comfortable, here are things that we need to do. We've had, certain things that you go through, and I think that's why in the Potsikov et al. Article I mentioned earlier, there are checklists there because there is an entity called contingent reinforcement versus non-contingent. And if you're going by every day, man, this is fantastic. It's wonderful. I really appreciate that. So one of the things that Judith Kamaki talks about in her operant leadership book is she talks that you have to be, in order to be a successful leader, you have to continually monitor. Okay, so as a result of monitoring, so I know we get reports every day about incident reports, late notes, if staff are up to speed on their medication administration, if they're following interaction styles. So I let the data guide what I'm doing. And if there's a struggle, we've had those times where I prefer not to do that in the home where they're working with the individuals that we serve. We prefer to do that coaching here in the office. But if you bring data and you have data to support it, then that's the way to do it. But people can take your meekness for weakness and run all over you if you are non-contingently positive or non-contingently praising. And so there are times where I'll use humor, where these things will happen. It's like, we had a staff recently that the client was out of soda. They were only supposed to have 5. They wanted the 6th one, and staff were going, "No, you are not gonna have it." And, staff got punched in the face. And so, the next day I said, "Okay, I understand. I really appreciate you following the rules, but what happened?" "Well, I got punched in the face." I said, "Okay, well, how did that work for you?" 1 extra soda is not gonna kill him. And so delivering the feedback that way. So I think that, and again, I'm a huge Godfather fan, imagine that. But I think that there's a line in that movie that holds up that, it's not personal, it's business. And if you can look at it that way and look at the thing is, personally, we had a young man here recently that we had to terminate his employment, and we shook hands and we hugged. And I said, "Dude, you're not a number." And he acknowledged, "Man, this was more than I thought I was getting myself into." And he was fine with it. But, I think that's something that you have to cultivate, or you ignore it and the problem grows. So I think it's a delicate balance. And I think the same individuals that cannot see themselves that they're being overly punitive, or you have the opposite side of that same coin where individuals, if they can't see maybe where they're being non-contingently positive and everything is good, and then people take advantage of that. So you have to be really, really careful to be somewhere in the middle. And it's tough. It's
Yeah,
tough. And
yeah.
that's
So
the
so so
paper.
how do you set that stage? Because I know both Polly and Anika Costa, they had this whole thing about tough talks and things like that, and as being business partners with them, that they might have had one or few tough talks with me, but
Yeah,
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 um,
right, right.
but that that's a whole that's a whole other story, perhaps outside of the pod. No, I'm just kidding. Love those guys, but you know, you've already kind of spoke to this, but if there's more to add, I'm just because again, I want to focus on people who are new to leading and managing. How do you set the stage for those tough talks? Threading that needle of yeah, you want to be positive, you want to be reinforcing, but not in a way that's counterproductive, and at the same time, you want to avoid that kind of type X leadership that you just described. And at the same time, you're dealing with a performance problem that needs to change. So are there other things that listeners can keep in mind as they're trying to wrestle with balancing all these challenges?
We call them crucial conversations. And I've had teams in the past where, the biggest, and I think we're doing a little review from our last podcast, but we, just from my experience through the years, that clinical teams and residential teams typically butt heads, because you're not my
Oh yeah.
boss, and we don't have the scientific. So we actually have a committee going within our organization now about how to bridge that. And so, there's a lot of stuff that hopefully that's a future paper. But I think as we're going through it, we went through, and I took our entire behavioral team through every chapter of the book, Crucial Conversations. It's a national bestseller. It's wonderful. But we walked through every chapter of that so people could understand. And one of the key concepts of that book, again, is stated in flashy layman's terms, but it's called the pool of shared knowledge. And many times the issue is that individuals that have crucial conversations or difficult to have conversations, people aren't working with the same learning history. So most leaders I find sit back in their office and they let their subordinates come in, or people they supervise tell them about how other people are doing. And RB Daniels always used to say, "Let me see that." He would always want to go and walk the floor of the factory and go look around and see how these things happen. So the pool of shared meaning is that we're all basing our information on the same set of facts. So if I have to have a difficult conversation with a BCBA because they're using profanity with the direct support staff or yelling at them about not following a behavior program, I then need to go and talk to one of the managers in the home and see if there were any witnesses and typically one of the things that we hear a lot here is that the clinical team thinks they're better than we are. And that's one I wanted to get on top of immediately because that's got a number of connotations that I don't like. And so nobody could give me an operational definition of why people think that or why they assess things that clinicians think they're better than it's because clinical person comes in and gives guidance around a program or whatever it might be, and they're not the direct supervisor of the staff member that they're giving the feedback to. So as a result, we have our clinicians co-supervise a lot of our direct support staff so that they kind of are their boss or they're accountable to them as well. And our director of our residential program has a master's in applied behavior analysis. One of our managers in a good part of our program is an RBT. So she understands, and when she tells people, here's how to do things and why we have to collect the data, and why John's got all these data sheets for us to fill out, that you have that pool of shared knowledge, so everybody understands where we're coming from. And I think if you have that, that's going to continue to happen. I think also the psychological safety is huge. If you create an environment where people can come to you and talk to you, you're going to have more of that happen. Whereas if it's an environment of silence, the things don't get, announced. I listened to, I think Shannon Biaggi was at our Moaba conference as well, and she talked about the elephant in the room, and she's got an exercise, and I keep one here too. So if we've got like an elephant in the room and there's this big discussion, I will pitch it to whoever the staff that maybe is related to that and say, okay, let's
hang
talk
on,
about.
hang on.
Yeah.
The audience doesn't know this.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've got, yeah, go ahead.
You're holding up a stuffed elephant. You don't
Yes.
literally have an elephant in your office. Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Yes. Don't have an elephant, right now. So but Shannon was talking about taking a stuffed elephant and, if it's an issue that's coming up, taking it out and, something in, some of the language of ACT, when you use diffusing or you use statements to, kind of look at diffusing certain situations or diffusion, that you take some of that meaning away and say, hey, okay, here's the elephant in the room right now. Is that the staff feel like that the behavior analysts are being too bossy and that they're not in charge of the staff and they can't tell them what to do. And so how do we fix that? Okay, I mean, do we tell the behavior analysts don't give feedback? Do we tell them how to deliver the feedback? Do we talk to the direct support staff and say, you hear and you listen to everything they say and you follow it? But that's the elephant in the room. So we have RBTs and we have residential managers and others in this group now where we're trying to solve this problem. That's the elephant of how do you get these two groups to work together? Because, Matt, in your work, when you go into a school or you go into a residential placement or whatever, many times they're not going to take your feedback. Or if you make suggestions, hey, I need you to fill this out, you go the next week and there's no documentation. We see this with families at times. So I think in order to be able to facilitate that, you really have to get to the nitty gritty. So that's one of the things, whether it's a paper or a book, that before I retire, I want to be able to as best as can be done, solve that problem. Because I think that it is the behavior analyst that works with adults will tell you this, that, and I say it everywhere I go and everywhere I talk, 60% of the work that you do is behavior analysis with the staff and 40% is behavior analysis with your client. And so if you look at it that way, then it tells you where your focus should be. And I think that's why it's so important. So you have to address a lot of times those things that are unspoken that people don't want to talk about.
Okay, so just to make sure I totally with you. So having the stuffed elephant is a symbol that there is sufficient safety in the room to bring up some of these things that would otherwise remain unspoken. Do I have that right?
Yeah. What's the elephant in the room? What's the thing that we're not talking about? And many times it's, we had an RBT a few weeks ago that she's very good with the direct support and helping her very aggressive client when it comes to routines and activities of daily living. And the staff would not help her. And they called her the caregiver and they wouldn't assist. and she's a female, the staff is a male. She wanted to kind of get some of this assistance. And so in our meeting, that's one of the things, okay, here's the elephant. How do we do this? Okay, how do you comfortably, because it's a group of, could be 6 to 8 staff on shift, and this is one clinical person. How do we address this and do so in a way that she doesn't feel blamed, like she did something wrong? Because that's half the conversations that are ignored, I think, is that people either don't want to put somebody on the spot or they don't want to upset somebody, so they just leave the conversation. And then the behavior gets worse. And then we get to a situation where maybe then the staff are doing something more serious, and maybe the client slips, falls, hurts themselves, hits their head, a more serious injury, or they engage in a redirection strategy that's not recommended by the behavioral team, and they get beaten pretty bad, sent to the hospital. That's a serious issue that we want to be able to avoid. And if you try to avoid the conversation, those things are going to happen eventually. So that's the goal. But yeah, you're exactly right with that.
That's brilliant. I love it. I'm going to go look for a stuffed elephant on Amazon after we conclude this conversation, because
They got little tiny ones. This one right here is probably the size of 2 business cards, stood up
Perfect.
straight. So
Perfect. Yeah.
it's easy.
Yeah. So you can get in a meeting, maybe people can throw it around.
Yeah. Right. Right.
What's your elephant in the room? What's your elephant? No, kidding. All right. Just a couple questions left here for you, John. One of them I've been thinking about since I've been reading the paper, and it's this, knowing Paulie very well and having spent time around you guys. You guys are very, very engaged, very outgoing. I don't know, perhaps described as extroverted, perhaps. I don't, people might tact it different ways. And so when people talk about leading and managing and things like that, I can imagine there's some people who are like, well, it's easy for you to say because you guys have these kind of outgoing personalities. You're senior in the field. You've got a lot of clout and, power or whatever you want to call it. And there might be some tendency to think that might be unreachable for me where I am. And again, I'm thinking of an early stage behavior analyst, maybe an RBT, or maybe if someone who was an RBT just became a BCBA, they're a case manager now. They've got their first caseload. They've got other RBTs they're supervising. They're not that distant from them temporally, those RBTs, or relationally or what have you. So that adds another angle, to perhaps the management conundrum or the leadership, challenge. Oh, I know a lot of these folks, suffer from imposter syndrome and oh my gosh, I'm a BCBA now. I never, and this is I feel a lot of responsibility and, so I, I'm struggling to form a question here. It's more of an observation, but I think you see where I'm getting at, right? How can someone listening to this who may not bring to bear the characteristics like someone like yourself or John Austin or, fill in the blank of these people who are, just really good at these things and have lots of experience and very confident in what they do. Contrast that with someone who is at the, is at the other end of all those continua. Can you talk to them about how this might be accessible to them regardless of?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful question too. I think 2 things.
I hope it's a wonderful question because it took me forever to ask it. So.
But I think it's one that is the elephant in the room because a lot of people look at, I am too young, and I had to, I'm too old to.
These old white guys can, talk out their rear all they want, but here I am,
I had no idea what an imposter syndrome was when I was an early, career behavior analyst. But I think, a couple of things is be consistent with your behavior, your verbal behavior, and your possibly your overt behavior. The things that you're doing versus the things that you're saying. If they're consistent. Another thing is write down if you're not the person that can kind of bring the person in. And my favorite mentor of all time was a student of Richard Fox, and he worked with Richard Fox. I think did some work with Nate Azrin, and Martin McMorrow is his name. And I keep up with him on Facebook whenever we were both in St. Louis recently, and how he posts things. And we were at Bonnie Raitt concert. He's like, "Hey, I'm here." So we were able to catch up and talk. He used to write us notes. I mean, this was first year out of grad school, and they were handwritten notes, and I still have a lot of them at home, where he would sit down, he would put the date and the time, March the 3rd, 19 whatever, 86, 87, 11 PM. So you could tell he's up and he's in his kitchen, he's writing, and he would write things about, hey, this plan and the way that the plan is done. And, when you're presenting about your clients, you talk about these guys and you're very comfortable. And it was something that, he didn't have to come in and be real splashy about it and kind of, go through and present it, but he was able to go through and put it all down in writing, which for some people, if they're not somebody that feels, comfortable in a social situation or being real effusive with their praise, they could just write that down and present that to the person. And I think that carries as much weight, if not more, because it's a permanent product.
Hmm.
And also another thing that Marty taught me is that, I have a list of, it's a program that we use, and I think that, I've got one. I keep these on my desk just so that I've got them, but it's, for the listeners, it's a form, and it's called I Noticed, and it's a written form. It's literally the size of an index card, or maybe the size of an ID, but it is, I'd like to acknowledge you for this, and here's the reason. So you give some overt behavior why this happened. You put their name, and you put the supervisor in there. And so you give a copy to the supervisor and you give a copy to them. But I like to go into the offices when people aren't here and maybe slide them in people's book or something like that. And so then it's not, because some people, they get embarrassed if you have a shout out in a staff meeting. Hey, this person has done great, and I really, and then you get emotional. No, that's not a lot of people. So I think even as an early career person, what the person did right just by virtue that you want to do something to acknowledge it. So I think as a result of that, there's nothing better than a handwritten note or some other type of acknowledgement like that, or a text message. I do that many times. I'll go through, like, we're admitting a new client today, and I'm going to go over and see how that's gone. But there's many times where I'll go in and I might, as I'm driving home, I'll text the manager and say, you know what, that was fantastic the way you handle this. And we are, I'm lucky to have you on our team. And that type of stuff really carries a lot of weight. It doesn't have to be face to face. And that's why I like to do the preference assessment with staff. How do you like your feedback? Sitting right here at the desk, do you like to have your feedback on the cell phone via a text or phone call or an email? And I'll tell you right now, for me, if it's interacting with people, I much prefer to have it to where if it's written or an email, that's how I like my communication. My preference assessment is I'm not a phone guy. I don't like that much, but they get to tell you how they like to receive feedback. And then as you're able to do it that way, that makes it easier. And then another shout out to John Austin, the original PDC, the performance diagnostic checklist before the human services version came out. I also give that to staff, and I have them fill that out, because it basically has you rate your supervisor on, are you being given the tools to do your job? Do you have an adequate job description? All these other things. And I think that's another thing. That way you're putting it on the other person. They write it down or they type it in and they send it back to you via email. And if you don't feel comfortable with, other modes of communication, that's another way to do it in a way that's less direct.
Yeah. So it sounds like, for leaders and managers to kind of recognize what their skill set is in terms of delivery, and then certainly matching that to the what the staff preferences are. Yeah, that's good advice. All right. So, as we're kind of maybe bringing this plane into the back to the runway here, I'm
Yeah.
curious about, so, you talked about some future directions for this type of model. I wanted to give you the opportunity to maybe elaborate more about that. You know, Sounds like it's something you're implementing there in your organization. In terms of dissemination or demonstrations and things like that, do you have any plans to, kind of, whether it's, this stuff is kind of hard to, I would imagine, to
Mhm.
do like rigorous empirical work on, but maybe I'm wrong. So all of that to say, where does this go from here?
I'd love to have a tool to go along with this. We love acronyms in our field, and maybe we call it the MAT, the Management Assessment Tool, or something like that. But, you have a tool I would love to have that could eventually you could have a manager or somebody fill out or have somebody fill out on them that gives you an idea of, okay, what's your style? In the Crucial Conversations book, there is there's a little test that you have to take with 30 or 40 questions, and it tells you what your style is in a difficult conversation. And so it's, do you go silent? Do you go violent? And it's got a number of different areas that it has where you are and you rate yourself. And I'm a go silent guy.
Oh, me too.
Like, okay, all right. And I've had supervisors tell me this before is that, that's the thing. And you just kind of, that's what I do. I avoid aversive stimuli. And so
Oh,
I think that that's not always the best, but those that go violent are the ones that tend to have the most negative feedback. But I would like something like that so that a supervisor could assess where they are on this continuum and maybe then have some suggestions about what they could do to flip that if they are on the wrong side of the continuum to where they're going violent or they're going silent. How do you then get to a crucial conversation to where you're having, because if you look at it, and sometimes it's no conversation. I think that nowadays politically there's no use of having a conversation. There is no use in going up to anybody and talking about what just happened with Venezuela. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You're not going to convince somebody if they're already on one side or the other. So
no.
realize that. And then no matter how many facts that you marshal or other things that you get together, I know whenever we had the biggest issue about Tylenol recently and about Tylenol causing autism, I had a lot of friends and people I grew up with that had literature that they had references to what they said were articles that showed that there was a cause, as well as people on the other side. And so you could argue about the small n, or is it a randomized controlled trial, or is it whatever, all day long. But at the end, you're not going to be able to convince that person. But if it's something where it's a conversation about your place of business and, you say this is going to have definitely a positive or a negative outcome on the client, I think that conversation is a lot easier to be able to have. So I think sometimes that's the best way, to be able to look at it and to kind of measure how do I have that conversation? When? How do I put those things in place? But I would love to see something eventually that could be of use. That would be an empirically based tool that maybe would have some good test, retest reliability and be able to, help out. And then maybe in the long run, if you, like I said earlier, if you can measure organizations and say, because on that tool, Steve Jobs probably would have scored very poorly, but I would say he was a tad successful. So I think as you look at that, there are ways that we have to look at and say, okay, that's the next question. Does that then lead to success? And my thought would be that probably more so in human services than in other fields, but who's to say?
Okay. All right. Real quick before we get out of here, you referenced the Stone Soup Conference. What are you
Yes,
talking
sir.
about, and why should people tune in?
Well, the Stone Soup Conference it's run by a fantastic group of individuals up in Canada that are providing services from ages 4 to 64. And we've really talked a lot as we were kind of going this in their support of this conference is to kind of leverage behavior analysis to be able to be more effective with people in the community, whether that's residential care or early intervention. And so I'm going to be talking about staff training. And so part of the process that we use here, we use behavioral skills training to kind of go through and get a lot of our managerial staff to where they're prepared to talk about the behavior support plan. People that maybe are not behaviorally inclined or trained to be able to train on this. So it is empirically based, research driven interventions with staff to be able to promote effective staff training in working with people that are primarily with severe problem behavior or have severe problem behavior profiles, but not necessarily, and kind of looking over that aspect of things from an adult services perspective, but also not to say that those things couldn't bleed over to other age groups. And guarantee you some of the work that Paulie and I are doing that we talked about today is going to probably seep in there as well.
Very good. Very good. And we'll have links where people can sign up for that if they are so inclined. There's a an array of good talks at this year's conference, and it's always fun to help those guys succeed in their mission of supporting individuals with disabilities in that corner of the
Absolutely.
world. So,
great folks.
Yeah, top notch for sure. All right, John. Well, I've got my homework cut out for me because I've got a page and a half here of notes of cool books and podcasts and articles and things like that. I'm going to do my best to get it all summed up for the show notes. I always appreciate you coming on to share what's on your mind. Congrats on the paper. I'm glad we were able to break some news here on the podcast. And it's good stuff. So it's good to see you again.
All right, great to see you again, Matt, too. And like I said at the beginning, it's always an honor and a privilege to be here. Thanks again.
Anytime.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.